order. It is 8:15, and the clerk has advised me that we have a quorum, and the witnesses and committee members that are appearing virtually have been sound tested, and all are good. Welcome to meeting number 107 of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Human Resources, Skills, Social Development, and the Status of Persons with Disabilities. Today's meeting is taking place in a hybrid format pursuant to the standing orders. Members are attending in person and attending remotely using Zoom. I would like to give you a few points to the participants. Please wait until I recognize you by name before speaking. For those participating by video conference, click on the microphone icon to activate your mic, and please mute yourself when not speaking. Interpretation for those on Zoom, you have the choice, as with those in the room, of participating in the official language of your choice. Interpretation is available using the headset and earpiece. Select the language of your choice. For those appearing virtually, click on the globe icon at the bottom of your surface and choose the language of your choice. If there's an issue with sound quality and interpretation, please get my attention. We'll suspend while it's being corrected. For those appearing virtually, use the raised hand icon. As well, please direct all questions and inquiries through I, the chair. And for those in the room, please remember if you could keep your earpiece away from the mic to prevent injury to the interpreters, who do an extremely valuable service for us. As well, if you could remember to speak slowly, it will give them the opportunity to translate effectively. Pursuant to the order of reference of Wednesday, October the 18th, 2023, the committee is continuing its study on Bill C-58, an act to amend the Canadian Labour Code and the Canadian Industrial Relations Board Regulations 2012. Appearing in the first hour, we have Confédération des Syndicats Nations, Caroline Seneville, President, who will deliver the opening comments. Iona Igaro? Could you pronounce your last name, sir? Igaros. Merci. Jean Pascal, political advisor. From the International Longshore and Warehouse Union Canada, we have Robert Ashton, President by video conference. Welcome, Mr. Ashton. And from the United Steelworkers Union, we have Marty Warren, National Director, who will deliver the opening statement, and Meg Gingrich, Assistant to the National Director. We will begin with Ms. Seneville for your opening comments. 5 minutes or less, please. You have the floor.
Bonjour. Good morning. Thank you very much for welcoming us. I would like to take a few seconds to introduce the CSN. It is a union with more than 100-year history in Quebec and Canada. We have more than 330,000 members in all activity sectors, both in the private and public sectors. Federally regulated, we have employees in communications, grain elevators, and the Union of Correctional Service Agents. And we are the Confédération des Syndicats Nationaux because we are based only in Quebec and Canada. We have no international representation. I'm very pleased, happy to be here before you this morning because you are studying a bill of capital importance for all workers throughout Canada, and that's rare. There are many bills, and this bill is an essential bill for Canadian workers. And I think this is a shared opinion because all parties in Parliament voted in favor. And you may or may not know, and I'll repeat it, but the right to associate is encoded in the Canadian Charter and also the international human rights. So you negotiate in good faith, you can associate to bargain in good faith, and you have the right to exercise your clout, to have a bargaining in good faith, to arrive at a good collective agreement. There are several Supreme Court decisions that have enshrined these rights. And for us, it is very simple. In the event of a workplace dispute, if you have replacement workers, you are entirely undermining the constitutional rights of Canadian workers. As you may know, going out on strike is no fun. It is not a decision anyone takes lighted. In fact, the Labor Code stipulates that to exercise your right to strike, you have to have a secret ballot vote. And when you're alone there in the voting booth with your pencil in hand and you're thinking about going on strike, you never know when you're going to go back to work. And you know that the economic impact of a strike is going to affect directly the worker who goes out on strike. So the decision is never taken lightly. So part of the clout we have was, undermined if replacement workers can be brought in. And it is especially the case when it is a lockout. Just imagine a lockout situation. It's a decision made by management, the employer. So it can be decided well in advance. It can be planned by hiring replacement workers well in advance. The employer has all the cards in their hand, and workers do not have an equal power, and that is not correct, and it is not in the spirit of either the Charter or recent Supreme Court decisions. We are here to talk about the bill, so we have specific comments on the actual bill. We are pleased to see that the bill takes into account the new reality, the new labor contexts, telework, working at a distance, remotely, and it takes into account different types of workplaces. We're from a province where we have anti-scab legislation already, and we're very happy. We've had it for a long time, even though there's some adjustments to be made. One of our main criticisms of this bill is the list of employees who would be governed by, a ban. This list of exceptions is way too long and undermines the whole purpose of the bill. There are too many holes and not enough cheese, if I can put it like that. The only exception we should have is to ensure essential services. And let's be clear, what we mean by essential services is when the life and safety of people is in danger. That's how we've been working in Quebec for more than 40 years. And no one has died because of a strike, and no one's gone hungry because of a strike. The CRB needs to have the necessary resources to make sure that the law is applied. We have to make sure that the legislation is applied. You need to have an investigative responsibility. We are all here, as citizens. If we were all speeding on the highway, I don't know that we would be more careful if we didn't have policemen monitoring us. We hope that this bill is implemented as soon as possible.
Next is Mr. Ashton for 5 minutes or less.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning from BC, and thank you for allowing me this opportunity before you all today. My name is Rob Ashton. I'm the president of ILW Canada, which represents 16,000 workers in BC and Saskatchewan in a variety of sectors, our largest sector being the maritime sector. The members of ILW Canada strongly support Bill C-58. We urge this committee to wholeheartedly support this bill to make it better for workers who vote in Canada. Strikes and lockouts are not easy on workers. That's why the decision to go on strike is made by the rank and file of the union. The decision to go on strike is one that workers make as a last resort to try and get a fairly negotiated settlement with their employers. But it's definitely at a financial loss for these workers. In regards to a lockout, the worker has no say in this, and employers impose this on them to break them as a united workforce. In fact, Employers use this option to cripple workers financially in the hopes they will become desperate and accept a lesser deal just to go back to work. Employers use the words like team member or you're part of the family, but then turn around and use scabs when the bottom line might be impacted. Employers that use scabs do not, never have, and never will care about their workers. They only see a path towards more profits, and in doing so, they hurt their employees while tearing communities apart. In my opinion, employers who use scabs have no regard about these consequences. When a strike or lockout happens, employers currently have an option to use scab labor. This puts the balance of power in the employer's hands as it keeps their products moving while at the same time turning worker against worker. This is a weapon of the bosses and can and will be used to break the backs of Canadians so that they can pocket more of the profits that are made off the backs of their employees. In the history of ILW Canada, in the Longshore Division, scabs were utilized on June 18, 1935. This day has been immortalized to be called the Battle of Ballantine Pier. On this day, longshore workers marched to the terminal to explain to the scabs that scabbing on us was not the right thing to do. That standing shoulder to shoulder with their fellow workers would help strengthen all workers and give the longshoremen of the day, a better chance at the bargaining table. But what happened was these workers and allies were attacked by police and private constables with batons and other weapons, as well as using tear gas on the Women's Auxiliary Aid Station. And this, I might add, was the first time tear gas was used on Canadians in Canada. This was done just because they were there. The use of scabs created conditions for violence perpetrated by employers and others against peaceful picketers that are only fighting for a fair collective agreement. This attack is an example of how some employers and some governments feel is the only way to end a strike or a lockout while scabs are being used. We wholeheartedly support Bill C-58 so that history does not have a chance to repeat itself and workers get a fair shake to get a freely negotiated collective agreement by the banning of scab labor federally. We are asking with urgency that this committee reduce the wait time for implementation of this bill to a zero wait time. Canadian workers need this bill passed and put into law with zero delay to level the playing field, as they say. Canadian workers have waited long enough and expect our elected representative to do what is right for workers. And in closing, I'd like to offer a message to the working class. If you are an environmentalist or a pipeline worker, a small shop owner or a longshoreman, we're all workers. Do not let the employing class split us, as division is the weapon of the employing class. And to our elected officials, as well as anyone else listening, I leave you all with a question from Pete Seeger in regards to Bill C-58. Which side are you on? I thank you for giving me this time to speak.
Thank you, Mr. Ashton. Now to Marty Warren for the United Steelworkers Union. Mr. Warren, you have 5 minutes or less.
Thank you, Chair, and through you, thank you to the clerk and to the members of the committee for the chance to join you today. I'm Marty Warren. I'm the National Director for the Steelworkers Union. The USW is the largest private sector union in North America, with 225,000 members in nearly every economic sector across Canada, including federally regulated members in rail, telecommunications, airport security, and ports. Steelworkers have been part of the anti-scab fight for decades, and our experience shows that bans on replacement workers improve labor relations, reduce the number and lengths of conflicts, and lead to better working and living standards for workers. Strikes and lockouts are hard enough on the community, but the use of scabs pits worker against workers, neighbors against neighbors, and sometimes even family members against family members. And further, it leads to decades of poor labor relations moving forward. Anti-scab legislation already exists in BC and Quebec, and soon in Manitoba will be added to the list. So we were happy when the NDP included the anti-scab legislation in the Supply and Confidence Agreement, and when the Liberals tabled that legislation. That said, it still falls short. It currently has loopholes, and employers will hire scabs and not live up to the intent of the legislation. Further, it's coming into force. Its delay is not reasonable. It's way too long. And as you can see from our submission, we have some clear recommendations to solve the problems. First, anyone doing the job of a worker who is on strike or lockout must be included in the ban, no matter what or when they were hired. As it stands, as long as they were hired on or contracted on or before the notice to bargain was served, employers could still use scabs, who are from outside the bargaining unit, from other locations, managerial or confidential employees, contractors or employees from another employer. Of course, we accept exceptions for work needed to prevent imminent threat of life, health and safety, destruction of property, and environmental damage. It brings me to the second recommendation. An agreement about who would perform the conservation work needs to be made between both the employer and the union. The bill currently leaves it to the employer alone. If both sides can't agree, it should go to the Industrial Relations Board. Unions should have the right of first refusal to perform such work. Third, any temporary employer hired to do conservation work cannot automatically become an employee in the bargaining unit. The current language would give preferential reinstatement to scabs over existing employees after the strike or lockout. That just doesn't make sense. Fourth, it needs to be clear that dependent contractors are not allowed to perform bargaining committee work. The bill specifically excludes dependent contractors from the ban, even though the Labour Code defines employee to include dependent contractors. The exception needs to be removed from Section 94B or 94.4B. Fifth, the waiting period for the IRB needs to be cut from 90 days to 45 days. At the very least, the IRB needs to issue an interim or bottom line decision within 45 days. Employers already take advantage of delays at the IRB for months and even years. And again, that has to be fixed, not allowed to get worse. Finally, and very importantly, the delay before implementation of the bill, once passed, needs to be scrapped. We have heard from public sector servants with experience that there's no need for this delay. If the government is serious about the law, it needs to come into force before the next election. It's far easier for the next government, whatever stripe they may be, to scrap a law that people haven't yet been able to use. And workers can't afford to wait. In just the last year, we had members at our tugboat operations in Quebec and telecom workers in BC struck on the line when scabs came through. Both these cases, if they had been provincially regulated, they would have had the protection of anti-scab legislation. But since they were not, they did not. So for the good of all federal regulated workers and to set an example to the provinces that still fall short, please accept and pass these amendments and let Bill C-58 pass implementation. Thank you.
Excuse me. Thank you, Mr. Warren. We'll now begin with the first round of questioning with Ms. Ms. Ferrari for 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you so much to our witnesses for being here. Thanks for representing so many amazing across the country that literally take care of us in so many different ways. To to Mr. Warren, I actually have a wonderful facility in my riding of Peterborough-Kawartha, the Canadian Welding Skills. They're a great organization, and a lot of those folks go on to be steel workers, obviously. A lot of the messages I'm getting from some of these steel workers, including some of the amazing women that are in this trade, which I'm so proud of, they're really having a hard time with, and we've heard this from other witnesses, the housing, the cost of living. These kinds of things are also impacting them at a great level as well. Childcare, we've heard from other witnesses as well. Are these issues you're hearing from your workers as well?
Yeah, there's no doubt those are the issues of the day. But I can tell you that's why belonging to a union, collective bargaining with anti-scab legislation is so important, because we know those that belong to a union have a better chance to push back on inflation, get to go to the bargaining table to argue about the cost of living. So for many reasons, inflation is high right now. And again, I can't emphasize enough why the anti-scab legislation is so important to level the playing field. So when workers go to bargain to offset stuff, as you've mentioned, that there's a level playing field to do so.
Yeah, I think so for sure. I think one of the crazy statistics that came out this past week was that you need 64% of your pre-taxed income to cover housing, right? It used to be like 34%. Now we're sitting at 64%. And I think that's when we look at retention and recruitment, or just families, you know, I'm Shadow Minister for Families, Children and Social Development. You see a real stressor on the families of trying to find that housing, if they can even find it. Obviously, you represent across the country. Are you finding some areas worse than others, or that housing issue being a key factor?
No, I think for sure housing is a factor for all working people. You know, whether it's the limited amount of homes or affordable living on the market, or whether it's structural change that has to happen in the real estate market. Quite frankly, I don't want to get deep into it, and I respect all the realtors. They are just working within their framework. But this idea of this blind bidding, this I got to go in with my best offer. We hear stories of people spending $60,000 more on a home than the closest bid, but it was a blind bidding process. And what does that do for the cost of housing? Once one house sells on the street for $60,000 over market price, obviously that sets the new trend. So I think there's many factors, but everybody is obviously struggling or trying to find ways to have affordable homes, affordable rent.
Yeah, one of the girls I know that is a steel worker, she's incredible. She just sent me this message, and she said, Michelle, I just went to get butter, and it went from $4.99 and it increased 83%. It's over $8 now. This is like simple things, right? When we look at sort of the impact of these workers and being able to show up for work and being stressed and all of those things that you've also spoke of. I think it's good to hear from you guys, because you represent these people that are truly building our country, right? And so it's nice to hear your feedback on that.
Yeah, no, and as I said, that's why it's so important for the ability to join a union, that it's not full of barriers and loopholes, and most importantly, a level playing field when you get to the bargaining table, so we can put those issues forward, so everybody or all workers can afford the dream.
2 minutes. So one of the things that we've seen that we've heard from some of the witnesses as well is in terms of contract services. We know that in 2015, the Liberal election platform, Justin Trudeau promised to save billions by reducing the use of external consultants. But in reality, spending on outsourcing has increased nearly 60% from the $10.4 billion spent when the Liberals took office.
In my introduction, I talked about it being a bill that was essential for the working class. You've used almost all of your speaking time on questions that have nothing to do with the bill. If you want to invite us to appear before a parliamentary committee on housing and other issues, it'd be a pleasure to do so. But this is a historic moment for workers, and we would appreciate questions on the bill. Thank you.
Important questions, and in terms of the workers that you represent and how it impacts them, because the question I just asked is in term about the external consultant. So I'm curious.
There was no interpretation on what we've just heard from Ms. Ferreri.
Continue, Ms. Ferrari.
So back to my question, I'll go back to Mr. Warren if I could, because we have heard this from other witnesses in regards to this about the external consultants. So I'm curious how that impacts your workers when we've seen an increase of nearly 60% from the $10.4 billion spent on when the Liberals took office.
Well, again, I'd like to emphasize what this Carolyn has said as well, that we're really here to talk about some important legislation that can level the playing field at collective bargaining so people can carve out a better living for them and their family. And your question, though, was,
About the external consultants. We've heard from other witnesses about...
I'm going to stay in my zone,
Okay.
which is the steelworkers zone and representing workers. So politically on that, how many contractors are used? Yeah, I mean, that's whatever. In telecoms, in that sector, I'm very concerned about the contracting out and the offshoring, but that's a separate discussion. So I'll leave it at that.
Okay, thanks for that. Ms. Senneville, do you have any concerns about the external consultants?
J'ai beaucoup de préoccupations par rapport.
I have many concerns with regard to the bill, especially for its implementation date and the exceptions contained therein. This bill is so extremely important for industrial peace. And I would like to repeat, just as my colleague said, the reason there is an anti-scab law in Quebec is that there were some very violent incidents on picket lines. There's communities where there are great, conflicts. So this legislation has been very important.
Madame Ferrari. Mr. Collins for 6 minutes. 6 minutes.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman, and thanks to all our witnesses for appearing this morning. Mr. Warren, I'll start with you. I had the opportunity to raise USW at our last meeting and the infamous Stelco strike of 1946 and USW's fight for a 40-hour work week as well as paid vacation. And it's the strike, as I've read, because I certainly wasn't around in those days in 1946, sounded a lot like what Mr. Ashton described in terms of the longshoremen's fight many decades ago. And, I thought that about Madame Senneville's opening comments where she talked about the bill is an essential bill. And if I had to go back, 60 or 70 years and say to those striking Stelco workers who were fighting against the 2,000 scab members brought in, that it would take 70 years to get us to where we are today, I think they'd be very shocked. So can you talk about the importance in terms of how this moves, the implementation of this bill moves the labor movement forward and helps other unions and all of those who fought for decades and probably longer at other levels of government to try to implement the same?
As I've said, it levels the playing field. But more importantly, the thing that I would stress through that question is everybody on this committee must understand when there is a strike or a lockout and scabs are brought into the facility, it destroys labor relations for decades. People don't forget that I was out trying to survive on picket pay, trying to feed my family as they watched other people either in darked out buses or what have you cross the picket line. And as I tell a lot of employers that that decision will come back and destroy labor relations for years. Our members don't forget. And more importantly, what I see as well is a lot of the decision making to bring in scabs are from a very high level of the employer. And quite frankly, they're gone in 2 or 3 years, and us and the locals management are left to pick up the pieces. And you destroy, and again, in this global economy, if you're going to be one of them world-class suppliers, one of those world-class manufacturers, labor relations is the secret ingredient. If you have strong labor relations, you can get anything done. Trust, really, building that relationship. You've got a problem. We care about the problem. We need to fix it. But when you treat our members and lock them out and bring in scabs, all that ability is gone. Because all they remember, whether it be their father, their grandfather, their grandmother, their aunt, was locked out for 6 months. Well, scabs took their job. So the impact on labor relations is huge. Decades of trying to fix it. Thank you.
Thanks. As a supplementary question, Mr. Warren, I'd ask you referenced in your opening the health and safety provision language that's in the bill. sort of the keep the lights on provisions that are in there to ensure that services that need to continue are protected and they're provided to the public. We've received correspondence from a handful of employers who've talked about their, the possible loss of 911 services, the inability for Canadians to travel when they need to. Can you talk about the language that's there now and what it does in terms of ensuring that services like 911 are still available to the public after a disruption after a lockout or strike?
Yeah, no, and I can speak to that. There is, from a union perspective, a steelworker perspective, there's the idea is not to cripple the public, is not to cripple the environment or affect. We need somewhere to go back to work. So having essential service, the powerhouse running, and any component of that, talk about travel. Absolutely, there's essential travel. But does that include every Canadian that wants to go on a vacation? Not sure. We can have that discussion. I would think essential travel could be this group here having to get in and out of Ottawa. You're running the country. Stuff like that is important. But I think that's why the discussion, as you heard me say, needs to first be done around essential services with the union and the employer. And if they can't figure it out, then it can go to the IRB. But I will add, the last comment I will add, we have, whether it be the provincial strikes, more provincial strikes than federal strikes, we've worked with employers. We've had our own members, and that's why it's important to talk to the union, come in and run the powerhouse, because when the work stoppage or lockout ends, is a negotiated settlement, we all need somewhere to go back that can get up and running in a fairly quick fashion.
Madame Senneville, I have about a minute left, and you referenced health and safety in your comments. And Quebec, of course, has been a leader in this area as it relates to the legislation that we're dealing with. Can you talk about the statistics in terms of how health and safety has probably been improved from not having replacement workers enter the workforce who might not have the same training as those people who are unionized?
Absolutely. We have a commission of essential services, employers, and workers. Let me start again. We have a commission on essential services where workers and employers can make representations. Yes, we've had public sector strikes, and if you're an accountant in a hospital, you're going to be on strike. If you're a nurse in intensive care, your strike time will be 0 minutes. It's 100% essential services. Same thing in municipal affairs or public transport. I've said it and I repeat it. We are capable of providing a level of essential services to avoid any risks and at the same time and maintain our clout at the bargaining table.
Mr. Collins, Madame Chabot pour 6 minutes.
Thank you very much, Chair. And thank you to our witnesses. And I want to say to my colleagues around the table, both from the Liberal Party and the Conservative Party, and of course the NBT, no problem, that we appreciate the union representations. We know how much unions contribute to our society to make it more fair, just, and democratic. And we greet all the very good work you do to defend workers. Ms. Senneville, my first question is for you. You talked about strikes in the public sector, and we've had historic Common Front strikes, and recently we've seen the negotiated settlement is always the best type of settlement, and you need a balance of power. And of course, no one wants to go out on strike, but it's sometimes necessary. Regarding the bill, there have been comments that the bill would not apply, to federal public servants. Now, is this something that you think needs to be revisited? Well, we represent workers in the federal public service, and they don't have a right to strike. They are correctional service officers. But along with the FTQ and the Canadian Labour Congress, we do believe, well, we've often regretted having two categories of workers in Quebec because of the absence of an anti-scab law at the federal level. So we don't want to be excluding public servants. Well, we all welcome the bill, but there's a difference between the fact that, it gets tabled and eventually adopted. There's a context of minority government where anything can happen, and we deplore that it would take 18 months after royal assent for the legislation to be implemented. It's a concern that it might never be implemented. So your comment about removing that 18-month delay, you want it to apply immediately at the time of royal assent? Indeed, I do. Now, we talked about cheese. I guess it was Gruyere cheese in the Quebec anti-scab law. Or it's impossible to hire an employee from a different bargaining unit. So, but in this bill, it would be allowed. I mean, if you want to prevent the use of replacement workers, we have in this bill a number of exceptions. So to what extent does this undermine the whole principle of the legislation? When you go on strike, you have to go on strike. If our work is then going to be done by other replacement workers, and there's a list of exceptions. Well, this is a big criticism we have. We have a list. There's a list of exceptions, subcontractors, other bargaining unit workers. Then what you don't have is a genuine strike. What we want to see is that the Supreme Court decisions apply. And when there's a decision to go out on strike, it is a real strike. And my colleagues can speak to the different exceptions, but in our opinion, those exceptions need to be deleted from the bill. We can provide essential services for employers that we're going to be hearing from in the second panel. On the list of essential services, employers would like to add, the issue of economic interest, which is very broad. And in your testimony, you said in regard to economic interest, when you have a strike, it's the worker who suffers the economic consequences. Now, do you think it is a good idea to add that in the list? Economic interests? Not a good idea. When you put that in the balance, it has nothing to do with risks. And risks for health, risks for safety. When you go out on strike, workers are deprived of salaries, but that's part of this balance of power. Employers do also suffer consequences. And what does that do? It puts pressure on the parties to come together to find a satisfactory settlement for the two parties. And both, for the business, the community, it's a win-win situation. So would you say that to favor replacement workers or let's say to prevent replacement workers from coming in, would it give rise to more strikes? No, I repeat it. I've said it. When you say we're out on strike, it is a huge decision with heavy consequences. You're not going for a day to the beach. Very clear. Mr. Warren, I have a question for you. Historically, with regard to the criminalization of strike and the impact on workers, the thing is that still today you have labor conflicts that are very lengthy. Steel workers in Quebec, we have the Sorel-Tracy port. The strike lasted for more than a year. Replacement workers were brought in, and they won 3 times the pay of the striking workers were earning. Is that acceptable?
On that in another answer if you choose. Merci, Madame.
Thank you, Ms. Chabot. Mr. Boulouris, the floor is yours. 6 minutes. Thank you so much, Chair. Before I ask my questions to the witness, I want to underscore the presence in the room of Sébastien, workers at Videotron in Gatineau. He's been in lockout for more than 6 months and is suffering that very fate that replacement workers are taking his job. I think it is important that we're not talking about things that happened 10 years ago or in the past. Today, we have workers suffering the consequences and are suffering. And thanks to Sébastien for being here with us today. Ms. Senville, you told us that you found it very emotional to be here, that this is an essential bill, a historic moment. I have to say I share the emotions with you. I would like to hear you talk about what this is going to bring to CSN members and other union federations. What's it going to change in your experience as a union leader? I've been an activist at the CSN for more than 25 years. And one of the conflicts that affected me the most was the Cargill grain elevator dispute on the north shore of Quebec. People were in strike for 38 months and saw replacement workers take their place. Truly, it is very difficult to live through that. That's one experience. Another, and I don't want to talk about, the asbestos strike. It goes way back in history, 1949. The asbestos strike, scabs were brought in, and that marked that community for generations. When I visited unions there in the 80s, they said, no, we're no longer talking to those neighbors. Those were scabs, strike breakers. It affects, it gives rise to so much stress throughout a community. And I think about the violence on the picket lines. When physically you have to prevent people from breaking through the picket lines, worker against worker. And the example given by Ms. Chabot, it's insult to injury when strike breakers are paid even more than the workers. Strike, but my mother was on strike in the public service in Canada to get maternity leave. Nobody around this table would ever question maternity leave. So strikes are tough, difficult for business, difficult for workers, but as a society, it helps us make progress. Social gains that were won year after year, decade after decade, by people who had courage to stand up. More specifically, you talked about the resources for CIRB, especially to conduct investigations. In the bill, which certainly can be improved, I could agree, an employer in a dispute could continue to do subcontracts that he used before sending out the notice, the notice would have gone out several months earlier. But to do tasks that are of the same nature and scope. So you need resources to be able to conduct an investigation to make sure that much is respected, because there could be slippage as well. So you need inspectors to be able to go out to see if the nature of work has changed, the number of hours, the number of tasks or types of tasks. If the bill is adopted, you need to be able to implement and apply the bill. So even if we want all of the exceptions to be deleted from the bill, even if that's adopted, we will still need inspectors to go out in the field. This is something we're experiencing in Quebec, in the hotel industry. We have to be able to conduct investigations. It's interesting what you say. The longer the exception list is long, the more complicated it is for inspectors to do their job. It will take more. The investigatory work will be more complex. So a strike is a strike is a strike. And we need the legislative means and also the tangible means Thank you, Mr. Warren, for being with us today. So I want to follow up on these exemptions, this use of replacement workers. You mentioned that there are too many loopholes. If we were to remove some of those exemptions, which ones would be the most important ones to remove, the priority ones?
They're all important just because unless they're there for essential services, that there is no reason for another worker, whatever category, to do the work of a locked out or striking member. So I think that's important, that I don't want to pick one above the other. But the fact is, it's kind of should be clear. Whatever we need for the essential services, and we talked about conservation, all others should be off the list. An example could be, sorry, just real quickly. No, I'm out of time. And what is the strike about? Like the tugboat operators that we experienced in Quebec, that wasn't a strike about economics. The scabs got more money than the steelworker tugboat operators.
Belarus, Ms. Gray for 5 minutes, please.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to all the witnesses for being here. And I also just want to comment quickly that it's great to have interpretation in person. This meeting is functioning very well compared to some other meetings, so thank you for whoever set that up. I wanted to talk about how it was recently released that the unemployment rate in Canada has jumped to 6.1% in March of this year, and it was 5.8% in February. And this 6.1% is a full percentage point over a year ago. And so what I'm wondering is if this is something that you're concerned with and that you're hearing about from your members, if there's concerns with this trend of the unemployment rate going up and of workers losing their jobs. So I would like to first ask that to the International Longshore and Warehouse Union Canada. Mr. Ashton, if you could maybe answer that first.
I don't mean to be rude, but I don't see the relevance to Bill C-58 when it comes to the unemployment rate in Canada. We're here to talk about anti-scab legislation, not an unemployment rate. I'm not here to give one political party, another political party, the ability to hit score points against one against the other. So I'll decline to comment. Thank you.
Okay. Well, this has to do with workers losing their jobs, and there was. It was strictly about workers losing their jobs. So maybe I'll go to United Steelworkers Union and see if you've heard concerns about workers losing their jobs.
No. I agree with the last witness as well. Really want to focus on the bill, but no, we haven't heard that at all. Our members aren't talking about that. We haven't suffered any major turndowns, and I'll leave it at that. Again, it comes to how do you do the calculation on unemployment, how the U.S. does it. You hear some, look at the U.S. Well, each calculation is different, and I'll leave it at that. That's for our research department and experts to speak on, not me, quite frankly.
Okay. Thank you for that. Actually, that brings to the other point that actually, the U.S. is actually down. It's Canada's has gone up, and I surely you work with other organizations cross-border. There's a lot of interconnection between our trade and with our supply chain. So, I wanted to see if you had a sense where that might be coming from. I'm not sure if you have anything to comment on that, but it's just concerning that we're trending one way and the U.S. is the other. And, just wanted to get a sense if your workers have any. If you're hearing any comments on that at all, no? No,
the short answer is no, but again, it's my understanding the math behind it is different in Canada and the U.S., so the comparison is probably apples and oranges, and I'll leave it at that.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. The other thing that we had heard actually at a previous meeting with some labor representatives is where the replacement of workers in the way of outsourced contractors and consultants can make workers feel undervalued and actually create stress or even affect their mental wellness when you've got these outside contractors basically doing work that workers could be doing. And perhaps you could even be expanding the workforce, but instead you've got these outside consultants. And so I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on this that you might want to share, and maybe I'll go to Mr. Warren first on this.
Well, the comment I would make on that is that there's no doubt about it. You can go in terms of the stress on workers when they see scabs crossing the picket line. Go to a picket line where scabs aren't crossing the picket line. It's a very, settled picket line. They're doing what they're doing with their right to protest, with their right to kind of, do what they do. Go where there's scabs crossing the picket line, and it's emotional, it's ugly, and it's like people are stealing their livelihood from them and their families and children. The other thing around scabs is it came up before. In Canada, there's 1,000 workers die a year on the job. And now you're going to start bringing in unskilled people, barely trained people. Why? Is it worth the life of a worker? So some business can make 10 more widgets while their workers are outside instead of going to the collective bargaining table and reaching an agreement.
Thank you. I know that my time is, I've only got a couple seconds here, and there is a memorial National Day recognizing workers that have lost their jobs, and I think that we should all recognize that. So thank you for bringing that up. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Gray. Mr. Long, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning. Good morning to my colleagues. Thank you to our witnesses this morning. Look, I think if we've ever seen an example of a party that doesn't want to talk about legislation, I think Canadians can see that today. I mean, the Conservative Party wants to talk about everything but this legislation. And I'm not going to talk about how a turkey was $100 2 years ago and I bought it for $35 2 weeks ago. I'm not going to talk about that. But, Ms. Senneville, to you, my question is this. Bill 377 and 525 were two, I think, stunning pieces of legislation that the Conservative Party brought forth in the last, or when they were in government, that were absolutely detrimental or devastating to unions. So I would just like you to talk to us, for the record, about 377 and 525, what they did to unions, and I want you to also comment on, again, on C-58 and how important that is, and I want you to dispel the myth that unions want to strike. Thank you.
C-337 and 25 are two anti-union pieces of legislation. They aimed at making it a lot more difficult to unionize and to reduce the field of action or scope of action of the unions. And in our opinion, it went against the Charter because we do have freedom of association under the Charter. And I said at the outset that this bill is going to transform the workplace in Canada. And that is a lot. You can look at statistics going back the years, many years. And in 1977, we had the anti-scab legislation introduced. We've never, had, issues. We've had violence on picket lines that's decreased. Ambulance coming to the picket lines that has decreased. That's one of the biggest impacts.
Thank you for that. Mr. Ashton, my riding is St. John, New Brunswick, proud port city. I have a great relationship with ILA 273, Terry Wilson there. We do a lot of many wonderful things together. I want you to talk to me about your experience with respect to just, you said your own words, obviously strikes and lockouts aren't easy. They're a last resort for unions. And, sometimes I get the feeling from my colleagues across in the Conservative Party that, unions want to strike. And, that couldn't be further from the truth. I know you just had an experience where you went through a strike. I just wonder if you can share your experience with us. Thank you.
Yeah, for sure. And Terry's a good friend of mine. He's a great trade unionist. I love the guy. Fantastic person. So yeah, strikes. They're actually horrible things to go through. We just went through in the Longshore Division in British Columbia a 13-day strike. My members didn't get paid for 1 day. My bargaining committee didn't get paid for 1 day. This is the effects and the changes that it has on families is detrimental of the worst kind. People have the ability to lose houses, and if they're long enough, people through mental health can lose their lives. Strikes are the last choice for workers and unions. We want a fairly negotiated collective agreement at the table as fast as we can, surprisingly, so that we can carry on with our business, and our business is doing our jobs, period, end of story. You know, in the maritime sector, when we deal with our employer associations, a lot of us don't see our employers at the table. We see a third party at the table, so we can't have direct conversations with them. And that's what drags it out, and that's what causes the issues at the bargaining table, because we're not allowed to have direct conversations with our direct employers because our third parties won't bring them. And so that slows bargaining down, and that creates a problem at the table, which in our last round of bargaining is what caused the 13-day strike. Every one of my members voted individually for their families, for a better life, and for a freely negotiated collective agreement. Every worker in Canada that votes to go on strike, it is the last thing workers want to do.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Ashton. Mr. Long, Madame Chabot, pour 2 minutes.
Ms. Chabot, 2.5 minutes. Thank you. Ms. Senville, in a number of sectors where you have members or represent members, one being telecommunications, and here we have just mentioned Videotron, and Videotron workers are locked out, and all of the call centers being affected, and the employer bringing in replacement workers. When you talk about the right to strike and preventing replacement workers from coming in, how do you see that fitting with a harmonious workplace? Well, workers can then focus on negotiations and not on protecting their picket lines. And when you arrive at a negotiated settlement, it means industrial peace. That is essential. What distinguishes a democratic society for other types of societies who are not democratic is protecting, safeguarding the right to strike. So even if it is difficult, and even if it's something that we do as a last resort, strikes are important to see progress in society. I want to underscore that in terms of adopting the bill, we'll go clause by clause. Then we have the 18-month wait, but the party in power seems to want to uphold the 18 months, which apparently is needed for the purposes of the CRB. What's your opinion? That new law would have to be implemented as quickly as possible. And when there's a will, there's a way. Thank you, Ms. Senville. Mr. Warren, what do you think about what happened in Quebec with replacement workers who were paid triple the wage of striking workers, and that was a year. And then, we had workers who had to leave entirely to find work. How can you prevent that from happening in the future?
How you prevent it is federal anti-scab legislation. Just real quickly on that point, yeah, that was an attack on workers, steelworkers and their families, and it was tried to crush the union versus trying to bargain a collective agreement.
Monsieur Bellers pour...
Thank you, Chair. I'm going to ask the same question of everyone, and I'll try to be brief. I only have 2.5 minutes. So the tone is going to be somewhat different. In the next hour, we'll hear a lot of the exceptions for being able to bring in replacement. We have to take into account the national economic interest. So in Europeans, what are the risks? What are the pitfalls with that? Mr. Warren?
Well, the pitfalls is that if it's not an essential duty to talk about the upkeep of the facility, the environment, the health and safety, the risk are the law doesn't have the teeth it needs. And any legislation that doesn't work, we can talk about the Westray law, but that doesn't work, it's ineffective. So to give it effect, to give it bargaining table effect, it must, again, limit the amount of workers. No shortcuts, no loopholes.
Je vais répondre en une phrase.
I'll answer. What it takes is a genuine anti-scab law, a real one.
Le piège que peut être...
So, Mr. Ashton, the pitfall of using national economic interests in an anti-scab law, what would be the impact on workers, in your opinion?
Every single employer in the country will say it's national economic impact on the country if that was added if that's in this legislation. The economic impacts of Canada should not be above workers' rights in this country. A worker should have the ability to go on strike no matter where they are and what they do. When I did my 13-day strike, I've heard people call me an economic terrorist. That's disgusting. We're representing workers. The economy of Canada has recovered and always does recover. So economics, let's talk economics. Let's talk about wages for workers.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur Ashton.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ashton, and to all our witnesses. Thank you, Chair.
Merci, Monsieur Bellers.
Thanks, Mr. Bulris.
The first round, and we must suspend for the next panel on behalf of the committee. Thank you to the witnesses that appeared in the first hour for your testimony. Merci beaucoup. We'll suspend for 3 minutes. Our witnesses are in the room, and there's no sound testing required, so 3 minutes. committee back to order for our second panel of witnesses. For the Canadian Federation of Agriculture, Brodie Berrigan, Director, Government Relations. Todd Lewis, Vice President. From the Canadian Federation of Independent Businesses, we have Christina Santini. Welcome. Director, National Affairs. Jasmine Gunnett. Jasmine Gunnett. It's like the music Jasmine. Oh, Jasmine Gunnett, Vice President, National Affairs. From the federally regulated employers, we have Derek Hines, President and Chief Executive Officer. Mr. Berrigan will be delivering the statement for Canadian Federation of Agriculture. Who's doing it? Mr. Lewis?
Yes.
Okay,
Yes.
Mr. Lewis, you have 5 minutes or less.
Well, hello, everybody, and thank you for the opportunity to speak today. My name is Todd Lewis. I'm a First Vice President of the Canadian Federation of Agriculture, and I grow grain, canola, and lentils just south of Regina, Saskatchewan, a little town called Gray. The CFA is Canada's largest general farm organization. We represent over 190,000 farmers and farm families across Canada. And they are at the heart of a Canadian agri-food system generating $143.8 billion of Canada's gross domestic product, about 7%. Canadian farmers proudly produce high-quality agriculture and agri-food products, of which over $92 billion worth were exported to trade partners around the world in 2022. Canada is an exporting nation. The flow of goods generated from trade is intimately tied to our standard of living. Countries around the world purchase Canadian agricultural products due to our reputation as a reliable supplier of high-quality products. However, if these products aren't able to reach overseas customers due to a prolonged labor disruption, this has a direct impact on Canadian farmers, the Canadian economy, and our reliability as an exporting nation. For example, as noted in the final report of the National Supply Chain Task Force, labor disruptions in 2018, 2019, 2021, and 2022 all affected how logistics and supply chain decision makers and international businesses view Canada's reliability as a place to do business, and that even the threat of strikes or lockout negatively affects the operation of the national transportation supply chain, and in turn Canada's reputation as a destination of choice for doing business. Let me be very clear. We recognize the importance of free and fair collective bargaining in Canada, and we support the rights of unionized workers to negotiate fairly with their employers. However, we believe that the movement of agriculture and agri-food products should be viewed as necessary, and certain exemptions must be made to the proposed legislation, Bill C-58, to recognize the importance of maintaining the movement of these goods during labor disputes. There is precedent for this. In 1998, amendments were made to the Canada Labour Code, sponsored by then Minister of Labour Lawrence Macaulay, which prohibited the cessation of work among longshore workers loading grain vessels during a strike or lockout. However, these amendments only apply to bulk grain movement and do not apply to container movement of grain and perishable goods. Prohibiting the use of replacement workers in federally regulated workplaces during a strike or lockout could cripple Canada's food supply chains. Because the railways have a dual monopoly over the shipment of grain in Canada, producers and shippers have very limited options, and in most cases, only one option to maintain service during labor disruption. As a result, we recommend that employers' ability to reassign existing non-unionized workers within a company, including management staff, be maintained when necessary to maintain Canada's domestic food and feed supply. Our hope would be that management could still provide critical functions during such stoppages to allow for the flow of agricultural goods. In our view, this would maintain the integrity of the collective bargaining process by preventing a return to full capacity, while at the same time providing a means of keeping some minimal level of service and the flow of agricultural goods where there are no other options for Canadian shippers. For this to be reflected in Bill C-58, we recommend the addition of a new paragraph C under Section 7 of the Canada Labour Code. Exception, threat, destruction, or damage, stating that the use of services is necessary to maintain the flow of essential goods necessary for the maintenance and preservation of Canada's domestic food and feed supply and global food security. The agriculture sector has faced 7 work stoppages over the past 6 years alone. Not only do prolonged work stoppages threaten our international reputation, but they do have real impacts on Canadian farmers and the Canadian economy. In conclusion, I'd like to thank you for this opportunity to speak today, and we would be happy to answer any of your questions you may have.
Thank you, Mr. Lewis. Ms. Santini for 5 minutes or less.
Bonjour, mon nom est Jasmin Guénette.
Good morning. My name is Jasmin Guénette.
Affairs with the Canadian Federation of Independent Business. I'm here with my colleague Christina Santini, who is Director of National Affairs. We would like to thank the committee for the invitation today. I will make my remarks in English, but can answer questions in both French and English. The CFIB, Canadian Federation of Independent Business, represents 97,000 small business owners in all sectors of the economy and in all regions of the country. Canadian SMEs who are concerned about the potential negative impact of this bill on their business, the people that they employ, and those they serve. Both my colleague and I will share comments for you to consider as you review the bill and look at potential amendments. First, it takes a simple majority of 50% plus one of members in a bargaining unit who vote in favor of a strike to launch one. Should a vote that would paralyze a large and essential infrastructure like port or railway and arm so many businesses not require a much higher threshold and a higher voter turnout. Also, should all offers and counter offers be disclosed to all concerned workers as soon as they are tabled? That could improve union democracy and transparency. Secondly, ports, railways, interprovincial trucking, and other federally regulated critical infrastructure should be considered essential service so that they remain operational at all times. Also, a long strike can have harmful consequences for the economy, which are disproportionate to the benefit one union can obtain. The negative economic impact of strikes on SMEs can be major. Loss of sales, loss of inventory, obligation to reduce production and worker hours, additional storage fee, and potential financial penalties based on contracts timeline. A long strike can undermine the ability of many individuals to earn a living along the supply chain. Could a cost analysis study by an independent third party be required to evaluate the cost and impacts of a strike for the economy, for SMEs, and for Canadians before any strike is even allowed to happen? If the impacts and costs are deemed potentially severe, a general strike could not be allowed.
Ultimately, the concern of this bill, as written, is that it could further embolden unions to walk away from the table and result in a greater incidence of strike action and even more disturbances along the supply chain. British Columbia and Quebec, where greater restrictions on the use of replacement workers have been enacted, have experienced more work stoppages than most of their counterparts, including the federally regulated private sector. Canada's SMEs, the people they employ, the communities they serve, and the economy they contribute to do not need more work stoppages. Overall, 73% of our members with an opinion said that they would not support a ban on replacement workers. And 92% supported having federally regulated workplaces that are instrumental to the supply chain as defined as essential services. Thus, the CFIB opposes the adoption of this bill. We continue to recommend that workers instrumental to the supply chain be deemed essential, referring them to binding arbitration. This bill needs to be thoroughly reviewed. We are happy to answer any questions. Thank you for having us.
Thank you, Ms. Santini. Mr. Hines for 5 minutes or less.
Thank you, Chair. I appear before you today as a representative from FETCO, an association representing most of Canada's major airlines, courier companies, marine ports, railways, telecom firms, and others in their capacity as employers. FETCO members employ nearly 2/3 of all workers in the federally regulated private sector. Our members are overwhelmingly unionized, with decades of productive collective bargaining with most major private sector unions. A lot has been said over the last few months related to Bill C-58, which will effectively ban the use of replacement workers during a work stoppage. Unfortunately, from our perspective, much of what has been said to date is simply not rooted in documented reality. This debate needs to be focused on evidence. The literature proves two things clearly. Replacement worker bans result in more strikes and longer strikes. These bans incentivize strike activity and discourage collective bargaining. Those most affected by replacement worker bans are everyday Canadians. When major employers like airlines, ports, railways, and telecoms are shut down, supply chains break. Shipments are halted, packages are not delivered, passengers are stranded, internet and cable services are shut down. Banking stops. Canadians from coast to coast to coast are affected because the critical services provided by major federally regulated organizations are no longer possible. To date, neither the government nor any union has presented a shred of documented evidence that demonstrates how this improves the collective bargaining process. In fact, the Minister of Labour reminds us that 96% of all bargaining in the federal private sector ends without a work stoppage. While it is not perfect, the system is working. This bill is proposing to fix a problem that does not exist. This debate was settled 30 years ago in a comprehensive review of the Canada Labour Code. Balance exists. Nothing is gained that can be demonstrably proven by banning replacement workers. Government should not be introducing legislation that is sure to add instability to already vulnerable supply chains. We need to set the record straight on what a replacement worker is. These are not scores of random people hired off the street. These are typically current employees of the company, such as managers or supervisors, or contractors with whom the employer has a pre-existing relationship. These are temporary measures. Replacement workers keep the lights on, providing a basic level of service until the strike ends. This is the collective bargaining system in action. It's not a flaw, but an actual design feature. When the strike ends, all unionized employees go back to work and temporary replacement workers leave. What is sometimes hidden in this debate is the fact that a replacement worker ban gives very small bargaining units in large organizations an ability to shut down the entire organization. This can happen at an airline, an airport, a railway, a marine port, or in telecom. The extended supply chain impacts can be extensive. Federal elected officials have known for decades this is a bad idea. Though it has come up at least a dozen times in the past 15 years, it has always been rejected by parliamentarians. There's nothing in this bill or the process that led to it that makes it any different from past efforts. Public policy should be based on documented facts. This is not that. As employers, we live in the real world. We recognize, given that we are here today, that this bill seems to be getting traction with MPs. Our preference is you reject this bill in its entirety. But if you're going to proceed, we sincerely urge you to amend it in several ways, as specifically requested in our submission to you filed recently. In short, 1, This bill needs more flexibility as it relates to the use of contractors. The bill is too restrictive in this space. Let us not lose sight of the fact that contractors are workers too, and many have long-lasting relationships with the organizations I represent. 2, unionized employees who want to work should not be prohibited from doing so. If you agree we live in an era of cost of living challenges, why would we take away anyone's right to choose to go to work? 3, exceptions to these rules must accommodate national economic interest or national economic security as it relates to both replacement workers and essential services. The current bar is simply too high. Threat to life, threat to destruction of property, threat of environmental disaster. These are apocalyptic level exceptions. And finally, dates to these provisions should back up, we believe, to notice of dispute rather than notice to bargain. Thank you, Chair. Sorry for going over.
You just signaled that your time was going. We'll now begin with Ms. Gray for the opening round of questions. Ms. Gray, for 6 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to all the witnesses for being here today. My first question is for the Canadian Federation of Agriculture. We know that there are a lot of incredible challenges that the agriculture industry is facing and that farmers are facing. And to just list a few, there's the announcements of restrictions on fertilizer usage, there's the yearly increases in carbon taxes, the announcement that just happened by the Bank of Canada where they're holding interest rates high. So any farmers that have loans or lines of credit, this is going to continue to cost them more. Payroll taxes increased on January 1st. And so I'm wondering if you, and there's others, but I'm wondering if you can speak to the cost pressures that Canadian farmers are facing and how this may affect the business decisions that they're making.
Yeah, I think, farmers are always price takers. We're not price makers. We can't negotiate prices that we receive for our product in the majority of agriculture in Canada. Of course, the supply management sector is different, but what we see, I think, is, when it comes to this kind of legislation where there's such big supply chains that are affected, something like a port or a railroad takes a long time to recover from a strike and to unwind what the backlog that occurs during a strike. The Canadian Grain Monitor Quorum suggested that for every day of a strike, it takes a week to unwind that at the port. So a 14-day strike, we can lose, up to a quarter of a shipping season because of that. And that backlogs all the way to the economic reality on Canadian farms where if we can't ship, we can't pay. We don't get paid. And I think that's, where we see the idea of, in this legislation, that we want an exception to ensure that Canadian products move. And at the same time, let's realize this is food security for not only Canada, but our international customers as well.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And also on that note, I wanted to ask about the carbon tax farm fuel exemptions that are being talked about. And I'm just wondering if you have any comments on that and how that could affect farmers.
Well, we really, of course, as farmers, we think Bill C-234 should go through unamended with the original, what was originally put forward by the House of Commons. And I think we'll just leave it at that.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you very much. I'll move over to the Canadian Federation of Independent Business. When you look at your members from across the country who are small and medium businesses and hearing about their challenges, we know that a lot of small businesses are still carrying a lot of debt, from the pandemic that they haven't been able to pay off. We know that again, with the higher interest rates, their debt loads are a lot more, their costs are going up. And so I'm wondering if you can speak to some of the current challenges that the small and medium-sized businesses are facing that you're hearing.
Certainly. Right now, the level of optimism of small business owner is quite low, and there are many reasons for that. One is that every single line of a small business budget is increasing, whether it's insurance costs, whether it's taxes, regulation costs, whether it's wage costs. Borrowing cost, every single line of a small business budget is increasing. Also, the current demand is falling, so there's a shortage, there's an insufficient domestic and foreign demand for our small businesses in Canada, and they are still facing a huge pressure in terms of labor shortages. And so you take small businesses that have to carry a huge amount of debt, notably because of the pandemic, the level of sales is low. The increased cost of doing business is hurting small businesses really hard, and so the current situation is quite difficult for many of our members.
Great, thank you very much. And a similar question over to federally regulated employers, transportation and communications. You do have some large employers, but also some smaller employers as well. And so similar question to you as to some of the business challenges that you're hearing from your members.
I would say the one thing that I hear regularly across the membership, and most of my members are large employers, there are a number of medium-sized employers in the mix, but lots of concern around, particularly in the space in which I operate around the workplace, a lot of regulatory burden. So that is certainly something I've heard from members, that they've seen more change in the last 5 to 6 to 7 years than they had seen decades previously. And that is certainly a real concern to them. This bill is a perfect example of that, and it's why we're here today to talk about it.
Great, thank you. So that would be red tape and regulatory burden. One of the other things that I'll just ask you really quickly is, because I'm almost out of time here, is with respect to the rate just increasing that we've heard about unemployment going up. And I'm wondering if you have any comments on that with the announcement of unemployment going up, and if you're hearing from any of your members about concerns over that.
Certainly members are concerned about the economy writ large. I represent a group of employers that provide critical services to Canadians. Obviously, we want those businesses to be successful. When they're successful, more Canadians are employed. So when we see an uptick in the unemployment rate, obviously that is a concern and one that we monitor closely.
Thank you.
Mr. Gray. Mr. Sheehan for 6 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you for the committee for allowing me to be here today to hear the testimony from the previous group of folks and these folks on this really important legislation ahead of us. Myself, I've been on both sides of the bargaining table. I've bargained for the union, I've bargained with the union, but at the end of the day, the best deals are at the table. And this is what the purpose of this is to keep people at the table. Because when people walk away from the table, no deal is being done. There's no negotiations. So one of the things that this C-58 has done is it talks about a maintenance of activities. And my first question is going to be to FETCO, to Derek. Your organization has claimed that this bill will lead to critical services such as 911 being cut off due to a strike. So, you know, I did some research into the maintenance of activities process and found that in 2003, TELUS reached a maintenance of activities agreement with Telecommunication Worker Union, which stipulated that members would be available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week during the labor dispute to repair telecommunication services for police, fire, ambulance, 911, hospitals, and the Coast Guard. So I noticed in the last panel, Mr. Collins here had asked the unions, are these agreements normal? And in fact, they said they couldn't imagine a scenario there wouldn't be such an agreement in place. So to FETCO, when you put out communications against the bill, did you know that the maintenance of activities process was meant to maintain these 911 services? Because there was some reaction from the public, but I would like you just to explain that particular scenario that I went through in the research and the importance that 911 services will still continue.
So I'm going to have to correct the assumption embedded in your question before I attempt to answer your question. In no literature that we put forward to the government did we show any concern that 911 services would not be provided. I didn't write it, and I wrote every submission that FETCO has provided in this space. I agree with you that is a level of service that would be provided and would be captured by a maintenance of services agreement. To speak more broadly about maintenance of services, we believe this doesn't solve the problem that the replacement worker bill causes. Maintenance of services agreements are extraordinarily difficult to achieve. In our experience, unions generally don't like them, and to agree on the terms of what will be embedded within those agreements is extraordinarily difficult. The bill envisions this is going to be done in 14 days. We think that's fantastical, and that the CIRB is then going to do it in 90 days. We also agree that's equally unlikely. So I guess my response to the overall issue around maintenance of services is, to us, it's perplexing that we would introduce a bill that would ban replacement workers knowing it's going to cause the challenges that it will cause around strikes, length and number and duration of strikes, and somehow imagine that a maintenance of services agreement in the bill is going to solve these problems when we don't actually think it will.
Well, thank you very much. And just, I've heard testimony not only at this committee, but at the Trade Committee, so I'll correct your assumption as well that replacement workers will prolong strikes. Everyone is saying no. That replacement workers, when put in place, whether a lockout or a strike, prolong the strike. Because again, no one's at the table when they're there, so it prolongs them. So that is what we've heard in this committee, and we've heard in other committees, and just through consultations. And on that note, FETCO had previously pointed to the track record of previous bills banning the use of replacement workers not being passed in the House of Commons. However, it's important to note the difference with Bill C-58, which has been its tri-party approach to consult with unions, government, and businesses. This included unions and business leaders sitting in multiple roundtables, shoulder to shoulder. There were extensive consultations that included 55 stakeholders and roundtables and 71 written submissions. And I understand that the consultations were even extended to January 31st, 2023, and at FETCO's request, many other businesses and stakeholders. So, we listened, we consulted broadly in a tri-party approach, and that informed our legislation. So, was FETCO consulted when the drafting the previous legislation banning? This is the previous, before C-58. Were you guys consulted on the other previous bills that you had pointed that were not successful?
There's a lot in your statement, and it's difficult for me to not respond to some of the comments that you made. The first point is around length and duration of strikes. These are not numbers that I'm pulling out of the sky. I mean, this is from the documented literature, from institutes such as the C.D. Howe Institute, from esteemed labor economist Morley Gunderson. I don't have time to read you the quotes, but the quotes basically say, if we think banning replacement workers is going to encourage collective bargaining and reduce strike activity, then that is just frankly not supported by the facts. Second point, tripartism. So yes, there were meetings that were held as this bill was introduced, but if I may take 30 seconds to provide some color to the committee, I was there. I was at the last, sorry, Chair, I was at the last committee, the last roundtable meeting. And it was a good session.
Just before I run out of time, I just wanted to bring forward that there is a communication that I have that you talked about with the absence of workers about emergency communications going down.
Okay.
So I just wanted to point out.
Mr. Sheen, Mr. Hines, the time has gone by. Madame Chabot pour 6 minutes.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to all our witnesses. I have a question for each of you. But before I go to my question, I would like to say that for the majority of us, this 2024 bill had become essential in the labour relations and what we have in the Canada Labour Code. We have this type of legislation that exists in Quebec since 1977, and there have never been any deaths. In fact, it's avoided a great deal of violence on picket lines. Now, my questions for the three of you is, do you acknowledge that the right to strike is a fundamental right protected under our charter? For each of you, please.
Yes.
We are not opposed to freedom of association. What it is we do not want work stoppages. We want to minimize work stoppages. But my question was not about associations. It was about the right to strike as recognized by the Charter, which is a corollary to negotiations. Do you acknowledge that the right to strike exists? It's fundamental? Nevertheless, you would like there to be replacement workers used in the event of strikes or lockouts. Is that not a negation of the right to strike? I'll switch to English, but I do want to just share
70.3 private sector work stoppages between the years of 2013 and 2022, with an average duration of 89 days with the provisions that it has in place. In the federally regulated space, there's only been 5.7 work stoppages on average during that same period, lasting on average 68 days. The reality is the best agreements, and even the panel before us stated, are reached at the table, and that's what we would like to see. We do not want to see a higher incidence of work stoppages, whether it be launched by the employer or the employee. That disrupts the supply chains, that affects small businesses, that affects the employees that small business owners employ and their livelihoods.
To say that you do not want strike is going far because it is a recognized right. And when we talk about supply chains and economic interests, it's fundamentally workers that you hire in each of your organizations. They are essential. You know, right now we have a labor shortage. We're talking a lot about skilled workers. So to undermine that legitimate right by stating they cannot go on strike because we need them, I don't think that it can contribute to healthy labor relations. You need a balance of power. And as to the length of conflicts, I think it's been demonstrated the length of a dispute is much longer. In Quebec, we have 2 lockouts right now. One that's lasted for more than 18 months at the Quebec City Port, where you have replacement workers in. So, you know, there are other people doing the work. Then you have Videotron call centers in Gatineau. So you have, you know, replacement workers coming in. It's an 18-month lockout. So do you truly believe that use of replacement workers is going to contribute to harmonious labor relations? Mr. Lewis.
Refer to my colleague.
Merci pour la question. I'm happy to respond on behalf of the Canadian Federation of Agriculture. In our view, you know, and not to repeat what Todd mentioned in his opening remarks, what we're proposing here is simply a balanced approach that would keep the lights on and maintain the movement of what we think are very necessary products in Canada, the food that we eat, when there is a labor disruption. And so it doesn't undermine the integrity of the collective bargaining processes by preventing a return to full capacity. But it does at the same time allow for a means of keeping some minimal level of service and the flow of agricultural goods.
Monsieur Arts?
So I would actually agree with most of what you just said, and that is I totally agree with you when you say that the right to strike is a fundamental right. Where I think we differ is we believe that the right to strike and the use of replacement workers can coexist in a system. And I continue bringing us back to the data. And what the data shows us is that banning replacement workers is not going to do anything to improve this system. Nothing has ever been documented to show that that will be an improvement. What we are hearing are anecdotal stories. Strikes are horrible. Employers don't want strikes any more than a union worker wants to be on strike. But they are a part of the system. Collective bargaining, as anybody that's been involved in it knows, is difficult. And sometimes they end in work stoppages. What we are arguing is that there should be circumstances when an employer can bring in on a temporary basis replacement workers to keep the lights on.
Monsieur Bouleverse pour 6 minutes.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you to the witnesses for being here today for the study of this bill, which is so essential and which I hold very close to my heart, although I have fundamental difference compared to you on the matter. You've all recognized the fundamental right of workers to be able to exercise pressure tactics, engage in a strike, and you've talked about balance. Mr. Lewis, you talked about, fair negotiations, and I think these are concepts we can all agree on. Worker organizations and collective bargaining was recognized many decades ago in Canada. So negotiations unfold in the interests of the two parties. Sometimes one party will win more gains than another. But it is to reduce the arbitrary and to improve the lot of workers. A good part of what we refer to now the days as middle class is the result of decades of many rounds of bargaining between the two parties. To make sure that a good part of profits doesn't just go into shareholders' pockets, but is shared more equitably between those who do the work and those who own the factory or the company. A good part of the creation of this collective wealth, which is more equitably shared, happens at the bargaining table where the two parties can exert pressure on each other, economic and financial pressures on each other. When workers decide to go on strike, they exert pressure by slowing down or putting a stop to the company's production. When an employer wants to get concessions out of employees that can put them in lockout, that puts pressure on employees who end up without any pay and they have to rely on their strike fund. Now, that balance of power allows for bargaining at the table and arriving at a compromise that is either satisfactory or unsatisfactory for the two parties. But it's a matter of compromise. So if there is a strike or lockout, the workers who are out in the streets, who are then replaced by strike breakers, or call them replacement workers, that balance of power is broken. The management party has an undeniable advantage because the production or service delivery continues. And the striker out in the street sees their clout diminish considerably. So the advantage is on the side of the employer. There's no incentive to come back to the bargaining table, which means that in most cases, conflicts last so much longer, and precisely because of the imbalance. Why would an employer go back to the bargaining table? If the company's production continue, revenue keeps coming in, there's no incentive to bargain with the trade union. If we want equitable negotiations, fair negotiations, we need fair balance of power between the two parties. Is that not right?
No, we would agree with that, but at the same time, from a producer's standpoint, we're not at the table, and we are greatly affected by these labor stoppages, or you don't even have to call them a labor stoppage. When collective bargaining breaks down and companies suffer a strike, farmers suffer as well. And I think that's where we're at, talking about a balance of power, is to try and have some exemptions, because for a producer, when we don't get shipping, we don't get paid. And if we don't do shipping, we lose sales as well. And a lost sale, we never recover from. That's gone. So I think this is part, to your point, for the balance of power. This is why it's so important for producers to have it recognized that some agricultural products should be moving. And again, it's to food security, both nationally and internationally. And it does affect prices. It's supply and demand. If the supply is cut off, the demand goes up and prices increase.
Et puis, je comprends votre point de vue, il est intéressant.
I understand your point of view, and it's interesting. And besides, I want to thank all of your members to, feed the citizens of Canada and export abroad. Now, there are already exemptions in the bill subcontractors who were hired prior to the round of bargaining, and also managers who could continue to do work during a strike or lockout. So there are already exceptions that ensure that the work would continue. Is that not a good point?
Merci pour la question. I would just say that there is, in fact, an exemption, as Todd mentioned in his opening remarks, that was negotiated back in 1998 when then Minister of Labour Lawrence MacAulay was responsible for this file, that exempted the bulk shipment of grain. What we would say on behalf of our members is we're seeing some shifts in the industry where increasingly, there's a reliance on container shipment. That trend has increased quite a bit from the time that original exemption was put in place. And those container shipments are not captured by that exemption, in addition to perishable goods. So that only applies to grain, bulk shipment of grain, but not any sort of perishable. You can think of frozen, meat products that are sitting in containers, fresh produce, which is can have a huge economic impact. And also, I would argue, and the evidence has been clear, contributed to a significant amount of food loss and food waste. And for a country and a government that has signed on to the Sustainable Development Goals, wanting to minimize food loss waste, then that's contradictory to that ultimate objective. Thank you.
LaRousse, Ms. Ferrari for 5.
Thank you so much, Chair. Thank you so much to the witnesses here. Two of my certainly favorite groups in Canada, farmers, small businesses. So thank you for being here. And not to dismiss you, Derek, I'm sorry. You're also representing great people too. I think one of the things that really jumps out at me when we look at the Federation of Independent Business, or CFIB, which we have here today, if you could just really quickly, because we have limited time, give an example of what those businesses across Canada, because isn't it 98% of Canada's economy is fueled by small business? Is that not a fair? So basically anybody who's a small business, I'm just thinking of an example to give people. Restaurants, all those things, right, would fall under small businesses.
Our members are in retail, so small mom and pop shop. Our member are small construction company.
Yeah.
Our member are also in agriculture. Our member are in wholesale, manufacturing. Our member are in the hospitality sector. 70% of our members are businesses under 10 employees. CFIB represent the smallest of the smallest. And what we have seen in the last few years when there was strikes at the Port of Montreal, BC ports, was an incredible impact on many of those businesses not being able to receive their goods, ship out their products or goods. And so CFIB is worried about this bill. And again, we represent those small businesses that we all have in our communities, serving our people and employing our people as well.
To that point, like I said, small businesses are definitely the heartbeat. And you mentioned in your comments earlier about morale and feelings. And what we see is, even in my small downtown of Peterborough, there's a mass exodus, closures every week, every month, more and more. People who can't sustain their businesses because of the debt that my colleague referred to as well.
Bells are ringing in the house. Bells are ringing. Do we have their 30-minute bell? I need a unanimous consent of the committee to continue. 10 minutes? 50? Okay, we'll go. Okay, thank you.
Non, Monsieur le Président, il n'y a pas de consent.
Mr. Chair, there's no need for unanimous consent. I apologize, didn't hear that. There's no unanimous consentment.
No? No, monsieur?
There is not consent? No. There's...
The committee, therefore... No, well... We have no witnesses. The bells are ringing in the House. The committee, by House of Commons rules, must have unanimous consent of the members to continue when the bells are ringing. We do not. I do not have unanimous consent. So at this time, I do have to adjourn the meeting. Committee members, the committee is adjourned.